And he was also longlisted in the 2020 International Booker Prize. Second is Suwan Kam. Yes, the lady in the middle. She's the author of 4 poetry book, short story collection, and she won the Scotia Bank Gillier Prize and was finalist at the National Book Critics Circle Awards. Her story have also won O. Henry Award and appeared in the New Yorker, Paris Review, and Harper's Magazine. She was born in a refugee camp in Nong Khai, and then she was educated, and she got huge success in Canada. Next to me, in beautiful yellow costume, Vietnamese costume, Quay May. She wrote international bestsellers, The Mountain Sing, which won multiple awards. And she also published 12 books of poetry, fiction and nonfiction in both Vietnamese and also English. And her works have been translated into 20 languages. And she also appeared in the New York Times. Her latest novel, Dust Child, also endorsed by the Times Reader Digest, and she was named by Forbes Vietnam among 20 inspiring women of 2021. Last but not least, Shivani. She has been writing and publishing fiction and poetry, and her latest book of fiction was entitled What Has Happened to Harry Pillar. She also has 2 novellas. She appeared in numerous international journals, and she is the national coordinator for the World Poetry Movement. So here are all my panelists for today. So I would like to start with the gentleman first. I would like you to probably talk about a little bit, because we have very limited time, only 40 minutes for the 4 of us, for all these 4 distinguished poets, and also 10 minutes for the Q&A. So a little bit about yourself and probably your works that you would like to share with our audience.
So I'm a Toba Batak poet from Indonesia, and I have published a book of poems called Sergius Six Bacchus. And Sergius and Bacchus is Arabic Christian saints. And my book deals heavily with queer Batak lives. And then people often ask me why I use Christian saints as a title of the book. And I said, as a queer, I am demonized basically my whole life. So I also want to be holy. I also want to be sacred. I also want to feel heavenly, something like that. And then I think the demonizations against queer people needs to be responded in all the kind of different ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Could I ask Ms. Shivani to say a few words?
Sure. So I think I'm from Malaysia, and my poetry has gone through quite an evolution, I think. So I first started writing when I was 13, 14, deeply misunderstood and needing a space to express myself. So poetry was always very confessional for me. But then it sort of began to change. I mean, my relationship with poetry began to change, and I started seeing it as a medium through which I could express things that were very nuanced, things that ordinary language couldn't capture. And because I grew up in a very small town called Port Dickson, which was basically out in nowhere, and there was a lot of the natural world around us. So I grew up with all kinds of wildlife that really inspired the writing. So I wrote a lot of poems about nature, about the natural world, that has since evolved into eco-poems. So more of a political consciousness around the natural world. So my poems these days are more conscious of environmental issues and my position as a diasporic person. So my grandparents came from Sri Lanka, in the early 20th century. And I've always felt a sense of deep, displacement. And so the poems that I write these days also capture that kind of diasporic consciousness. So there are lots of poems about my ancestors and yearning to connect with the place left and what that means being a Malaysian in Malaysia in the 21st century. So.
Thank you. Now we would like to hear from Suwankam.
I've been writing poetry for 25 years, and anytime I hear about readers and their attitude about poetry, that it's too hard or that it's difficult or they don't like it, I always become really disappointed, because you'll hear from everyone tonight here that it's such a shame to not read poetry or to think that it's difficult or hard and to stay away from it. So I'm always so grateful, like I am right now, to see so many people in the audience, because you could be anywhere else, but you're here joining us and wanting to listen to poetry and hear us talk about it. So I'm just really grateful, and I'm just a fan of everybody here.
Thank you. Quay Mai.
Hi everyone, we have more people coming in. Wow, poetry is certainly getting popular. But really, thank you so much for attending this session and to listen to poetry and to be here as one of the last sessions of the festivals today. It's my great honor to be here with these award-winning poets who also write prose. So we all have this common thing, like we write both poetry and prose. And I think for me, I wrote prose. I wrote my novels because I wanted to cheat readers into reading my poetry. So actually, I'm a fan of the panelists here. I have even written a poem to Norman, dedicated to Norman, after I heard his session at the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival. So it is really amazing to be here. I was born into the Vietnam War, and I grew up without food to eat. But what I had plenty of was poetry. We listened to poetry on national radio broadcast. I listened to poetry from my mother's lullabies. And in Vietnam, we have this really famous poet, Phùng Quán, who wrote this. Có những phút ngã lòng tôi vịnh câu thơ và đứng dậy. During moments of difficulty, I hold on to the verse of poetry to pull myself up. So poetry is really the pillar of the Vietnamese life.
Thank you. That is very powerful. Yeah, so once you started talking, we begin to invite, have more audience coming in. As Suwankam said earlier, that when people talk about poetry, they kind of feel a little bit scared. When they feel more comfortable reading short stories, reading novels. But once it comes to poetry, the audience, the students as well, they will say, oh, I don't understand. It's very difficult. But then how, as a poet and also as a prose writer, as a short story writer, fiction writer, how would you charm the audience with your poetry? What strategy could you use to invite people to read your poems? Any?
I don't think I'm a charming poet. So.
But you are a charming gentleman.
But I mean, I feel like most of my poems came from my anger.
Oh.
So, yeah, I don't think I'm charming. Maybe people can just feel the anger.
Oh,
and if they felt it and they understood why, I think it's enough in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about you, Shiwari?
Well, I think the performing of poetry is one very crucial way of engaging and involving the audience. I was recently in South America for a couple of poetry festivals. And when I was there, that insight really struck me that when the poet stands up and the poets bring their whole being onto the stage and just bringing the emotions, performing the emotions, sharing the emotions with the people, it can be an incredibly powerful and moving experience. So I think that when you are reading your poems out, because poetry is meant to be heard, it's meant to be
right.
really experienced. There's an
Yes.
experiential quality about poetry
Yeah.
that I think the poet can bring when they're with people in the audience.
Yeah, because when you read poetry, it's not just the alphabets or the letters on the page, but you need to hear the rhythm of the poems. You need to hear how the words sound. And the sound also convey the senses. What would you say, Swankam?
I first read my poetry in dingy bars. And so I'm always having to compete with the alcohol, with people passing,
Okay.
walking back and forth.
Yes.
Or a sports game on the television. And I always find that when you sound clear, you get people in the room to listen to what you say. That your work, your writing, the space that you give it yourself, it upholds itself, and people forget about the sports game, what else is happening in the room, and they pay attention. I think people know what they want to listen to, and you provide that in that moment, and the right people will rise to the occasion and give you their ear.
So poetry for you is like a kind of performance that would motivate, that would engage people,
Yes,
like better than all the games that they are playing.
yes.
What would you say?
Yeah, I agree that poetry is like the language on the page. I think you absorb a poem differently when you read it by yourself on the page. You are alone with the poem, you make sense, you build a world around a poem. But when you listen to the poet performing the poem, it's a totally different experience. So we have the National Poetry Day in Vietnam, which is like 2 weeks after the Vietnamese New Year. And thousands of people gather to listen to poetry, and it's like a very happy occasion. And if you ever go to Hanoi, you should go to the Temple of Literature. We have the Temple of Literature in Hanoi. That's the first university, and that's the first university of Vietnam, and where we held the poetry festival every year. And you know, it's like magical to be there to listen to the performances of poetry. It's really an occasion where, you know, like people really celebrate poets, and on that day we are like rock stars.
Yeah, right.
Which is rare.
Right.
I was going to
Yes,
say, unless you're
please.
T.S. Eliot or Pablo Neruda, who were notoriously bad readers of their own poetry, right?
Yeah. Now that you mentioned that poetry, the poets are more like rock stars, you know, to engage the audience. That reminds me of like the performance poetry, especially Allen Ginsberg, American poet, and he was reading his poetry at the same time he was stripping on the stage, and that was very it was vulgar, but it was very effective. That's the part of the Beat generation. And then with the also it's not just poetry, but it's poetry. The poems are accompanied by a musical band. And then at that time, the Beat generation in the 1950s and 60s. So poetry is not just a poem on the page, but it comes alive, and it comes out to stimulate to stimulate your senses and your intellect. Now that we have heard our distinguished poets talking about their perspective of poetry, now we would like to hear hear their inspiration, hear their creativity from their poetic lines. So I would like them to entertain you with some entertain the audience, of course, fascinate the audience or dazzle the audience with the.
I just wanted to say there will be no stripping.
I was looking into the audience, and I could see their eyes was growing wide and dazzling. What could I expect next? So you extinguished their dreams altogether. Yes. But anyway, probably not just reciting your poems, but probably performing. You can just, I don't know, you can just stand up and dramatize the lines that you would like to convey to us. Please, because we have got like beautiful people on the stage with me. Young, handsome gentlemen, beautiful ladies. So why not? So we'll make this, because poetry is, Dylan Thomas say that poetry is what makes me laugh or cry or yaw, or what makes my toenails twinkle. And William Wordsworth, a very remarkable 19th century British poet, say poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And Emily Dickinson, a very unique American poet in the 19th century, said, if I read a book and it makes my body so cold, no fire ever can warm me, I know that is poetry. Edgar Allan Poe, talking about poetry and the rhythm, the sound of poetry, and he said, poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty. William Shakespeare, of course, you love him. Poetry is the art which uses words as both speech and song to reveal. So I end with William Shakespeare, who said poetry is the art which uses words as both speech and song to reveal. So my panelists will recite to you the lines of poetry in which they will dance and sing to you, not stripped. Sorry. Okay, could I start with Wemai? Please stand up and then dramatize your lovely poem.
Please don't have high expectations. She put so many high expectations on us.
No.
Sorry.
We can use all kind of imagination. So here we are in the realm of poetry, and imagination is the heart of poetry. So you can use your own imagination. She could wear not just yellow, but probably red or pink or violet. Please.
So I'm going to read a very short poem in Vietnamese and English because I wrote my poetry originally in Vietnamese. And at the end of this poem, I'm going to perform a little bit the traditional Vietnamese poetry performance style called ngâm thơ, or singing the poetry. And my singing is really bad. I never could sing in front of a Vietnamese audience, but you are not Vietnamese, except for my friend Ian, so that's why I'm being brave. So this my poem is about my mom. My mom is inspiration for me. She lost her parents from a very young age, but she worked really hard, and she always told me, go to school. School education is the key to your future. So I'm really grateful to her, and I couldn't be here without the hard work of my mom. Gian bếp của mẹ. Qua đôi mắt tuổi thơ tôi nhìn mẹ tôi tất tả trong gian bếp được dựng lên bằng rơm và bùn quánh. Mẹ nhấc đũa lên quấy nắng vào nồi cơm đang sôi. Vạt áo mẹ đậm hương thơm của mùa gặt mới. Tay mẹ mớm rơm khô cho ngọn lửa đói bập bùng. Tôi muốn đến cạnh bên và giúp mẹ, nhưng đứa trẻ trong tôi kéo tôi chui vào góc bếp tối thẳm. Từ nơi đó tôi nhìn gương mặt mẹ dạy cho vẻ đẹp cách bừng lên trong gian khổ và cách hát cho cơm sôi bằng đôi tay rám nắng của người. Ngày hôm đó trong gian bếp của tuổi thơ tôi, sự hoàn hảo được sắp đặt bằng những chiếc nồi đen tuyền bồ hong, và bởi chiếc lưng khom của mẹ mỏng manh trông chênh sẽ biến mất nếu tôi khóc hay kêu lên. My mother's rise. Through the eyes of my childhood, I watched my mother, who labored in a kitchen built from straw and mud. She lifted a pair of chopsticks and threw sunlight into a pot of boiling rice. The perfume of a new harvest soaked her worn shirt as she bent and fed rice straws to the hungry flames. I wanted to come and help, but the child in me pulled myself into a dark corner where I could watch my mother's face, teach beauty how to glow in hardship and how to sing the rice to cook with her sun-baked hands. That day in our kitchen, I saw how perfection was arranged by soot-blackened pans and pots and by the bent back of my mother. So thin, she would disappear if I wept or cried out. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. So could I pass the microphone to Suwankam to do some dramatic acts? Please stand up, please.
The thing about my poetry is that it's the language that's dramatic, not me. Poem for the rain. Rubber boots, umbrellas, windows, doors, a roof, the gutter. We invent so much to keep from you. You have been talking to us through wreck, through clutter, saying the same thing we've never listened to. What arms, what hands there are, have never held, have never been held. Wherever your mouth is, it's never been kissed. And if there is a heart attached to any of this, it is as boundless as the rest, beating always against everything. The snow. The snow tries so hard to be like the rain. It will fall into the same places, an open petal, a trellis stem, a metal fence. It will know the hard pound of cement against its cold chest, what it is like to be left or thrown aside, the path of every gutter, and that everything in this world is against it, even the sun. A grasshopper. A grasshopper leaps into heaven, asking for a place. At every leap, heaven turns it away, places it back into this field. Its small body, worn down and beaten, clotted and covered with so much earth, poised to ask again. And my last one for now. The snail. The snail sets what it knows of this inelegant world outside and quietly folds its body into a small cathedral. Out here, you wonder, what is it praying for? And who will hear these small questions beneath all this bent bone? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very vivid, very pictorial poems. And then we would like to hear from Miss Shivani. Share with us your fascinating lines.
So I'll read two poems. The first one is an eco poem, and the second one is a very recent poem that I wrote because I was full of fear. So the first one's called We Don't Speak of Bitter Things. We don't speak of bitter things like land legacies, policies steeped in transposed speech, ideologies printed on temperate stones. We're disenchanted, living on frayed rope coiled around an equator, fertile. We're characters in dreams foreigners had lifetimes ago. Now here we are, bulldozing lifelines for dream scripts birthed in minds we're suckling still. I'm starting to believe we're imposters in human clothing. But we do not speak of bitter things. Trees felled, panthers poached, elephants stalked, emerge from fabulous dreams, cooers of the universe. Hush, come this way. We've made the map of the world. No life, no, it's the map of God. Hush, and come this way. There's no need to speak of bitter things. The land no longer fits your feet. The rhythm of your heart is a student here. Your words are mourning language. This is the one I wrote when I was full of fears. It's called I Eat Fears. I eat fears like I eat glass sweets, turn them around in my mouth, run my tongue around over them, licked and pierced in a snap. I eat fears like I eat custard apples, suck, spit, inhale, squeezed against my dark hands, massaged wet for the festival of stars. Your fears I eat. One by one, juices spilling over my lips, bring them on a tray, arrange your fears if you like, garnished with memories, past notions and motions. I do not care, but bring them in cocktail glasses, in a fistful of confetti, in bowls made of sand. What do I care how they come, in what receptacle you choose to present your whirls and swirls? On quiet midnight walks, people ask me, how do you eat fears? I don't need to tell them, because this is my utterance for you alone. I've seen something as clear and as gorgeous as a seabird stopping to watch itself on the sea's surface. That fear is love on a different route home. So when I say I eat fears, I'm only saying it's my gesture of love, for the love gliding inside your chest like so many night birds dancing their way home, dazzled by starlight. Thank you.
Thank you for very powerful and thought-provoking recital of the poem. Last but not least, we have Norman trying to search for his poem.
Yeah.
Please stand up.
Do you still remember your dream job? So I'm gonna read a poem called "My Dream Job," and it's from a book that I finished. It's called "My Dream Job," and the job in the title refers to the employment and prophet job in the Old Testament. I'm gonna read the employment one. My dream job grew up with me on the green fence house near the river, 10 kilometers from the exit of the highway. My parents always worked, let us non-biological twins roam and ruin the house. We read Chanswe in the morning, drank last night coffee throughout the day, taught ourselves how to talk to see-through fish before we went to bed. Chanswe, the Chinese author whose name means the dirty snow that refused to melt. We, my dream job and I, are also exceptionally dirty. 2 brown chimeras of meat and mud, as my dream job liked to flirt with the hot afternoons, swimming along the baby mosquitoes. My dream job spoke crabs. My dream job walked with me to where the school bus wait for us. Inside, my dream job would just give up their seat. With the sisters encircling us at the school, my dream job learned about the world with me. In the library, we gathered the Greek, the German, the Toba-Batak word for river. We wed the 3 of them, alchemized a linguistic polyamory. The liquid trinity gave birth to countless amounts of rivers, a new generation of water. For a moment, we were giving out rivers for free. People loved our rivers because our rivers remember. After the night's Hail Mary, my dream job would whisper at me. In the dark, we would reach for one another. Each time we succeeded, I found our hands were still covered with prayers. I would lick the prayers away. My stomach would go full of grease. One day, I was supposed to grow up and wear my dream job like clothes. My dream job was supposed to stay the same. I was supposed to go to tall buildings and play with money. I was supposed to buy back my parents from their houses of work. This was the way of the world, the sister said. They hinted that money was water as well, and that was why they were called liquid. One day, I would grow into my dream job, the sister said. Walk around tall buildings, play with money. One day, everyone would forget my dream job, the sister said. But not our rivers, I said. Who will remember?
Norman, thank you for sharing with us your experience of the dream job. I think that probably you can relate with him because everybody has your own dream job now or in the past. To be a poet, you need to have the inspiration. And how does the inspiration come to you? Who is the goddess of the muse that comes to you? So I would like to ask my panelists. So how does the inspiration come to you? That is the first question. And the second question is, how do you get your raw material for the content of your poetry? Starting with Hui Mai, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the beautiful readings. For me, poetry is the inspiration from poetry. For me, always comes from the everyday life. I'm inspired by the ordinary working people of Vietnam. For me, they are my heroes. So my poetry is about the street sellers of Vietnam, the garbage collectors, the war veterans whose stories no one wants to hear from anymore, and who need someone to speak to. I once, went back to Vietnam, and instead of going around by taxis, I always want to go with motorbike taxis. These are, like people who don't have a formal job and who who stay with their motorbikes at street corners, and they would bring you everywhere, like in Bangkok, right? Do you have motorbike taxis in Bangkok? In Vietnam, we have many of those people, and I think it's so. I love speaking with them because, by the time you finish the ride, you would get to know the whole person's life. and I think they wanted to talk to people. So I think I'm inspired by stories of working people of Vietnam.
Thank you. So you focus on the common people and the common experience, and you like to be in touch with the movers and shakers of the society. And Suwankam, please.
Inspiration for me comes from reading, from hearing other poets recite their work. I like to look at an object, a thing, and write about it. Even though, as you've heard tonight, I wrote about the rain, the snow, a grasshopper, a snail. We all know what those things are, but we don't see it in the same way. And one of the things that I love about writing poetry is that I can show you what I see and what I notice. And in that small moment, maybe we can meet and see the world in the same way.
Thank you for sharing with us. Shivani, please.
Typically, it comes in two ways. I can be very intentional with writing, so not waiting for inspiration to come, but actually just setting the intention that I'm going to write. So during the pandemic, for example, during a tense lockdown period, I spent it with my parents. I was amazed that I actually had a good time because I spent like a whole month with the family. So I just sat down. I said, you know what? I want to write poetry. I want to connect with the natural world around me. I want to connect back with myself because I think many of us felt very disconnected. And so I just sat on the front porch, put a stool down, and just basically waited. I mean, I said I was going to retrieve poetry. And so so I have seasons like that when I'm just sort of like, I want to write and let's see what comes. And that, I started writing like that when I heard the story of Rilke, the poet Rilke, who went to visit the sculptor Rodin. And he was complaining to Rodin, and he said, oh, you sculptors, it's so easy for you because your material is there. You just need to go and start sculpting. And they said, you can do the same thing. You can just go out and find, like what Suwankam was saying, just like objects, and then start creating from that. And then Rilke wrote his collection of poetry, writing about the panther, etc. So when I heard that story, I was like, you know what? I can do the same thing. So I can be intentional in that way. And then just when I have a very, very strong response to something, so from a very deep emotional space, the emotions sort of bring up the urge to write something.
So from reading of Suwankam to very strong response to the things around you, what's happening around you. What about you, Norman?
My anger informed my poetry. So this poem, my dream job, so that dream job is not mine, it's my parents. So the dream job is the idea of how I should be. So when I won the National Poetry Award in Indonesia, I was a tax accountant. And because winning it, many poets were angry that a queer poet won something big. And then I got outed and I have to leave the job. So when I talk about this dream job, it's kind of like an eulogy to this thing that isn't even mine. So sometimes how do I mourn something that isn't even mine from the first place? That's the whole idea of the poem. And then why I talk about river, it's actually to mention the violence happening to Batak people because of the colonization and the German mission. So like when I said the Greek and German and Toba Batak word, I imagine it's kind of like a translation of the Bible from the Greek version to German, and Toba Batak, and then this translation of this whole supposedly holy book brought violence to my people, and then, but I imagine it's kind of like, in a way, also kind of like, imagine it's like linguistic polyamory. That's how I kind of, so this kind of like, this is the tone of what's happening, and then the background for the poem. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So now that Norman talked about the feeling of anger, fury. So I would like to ask my panelists also, so what kind of feeling that you kind of are obsessed with in your poems? Is the feeling of love, the feeling of longing for something, searching for something, feeling of hope, optimism, as different from Norman has, like feeling of fear. So your poetry express feelings.
I think, poetry is a great way of expressions, different types of emotions, So I also write about anger, about fear, about being in love, about longing for home, about, family. So poetry can be a convey of everything. So it's like a poet. For me, my novels are my epic poems, I would say, because I have a lot more space to express my emotions and feelings.
Others would like to add to this?
Well, when you have a feeling, you have it by yourself and all alone. And like when I say I'm sad, no one else feels that sadness or that experience of sadness. But when you write a poem, you are less alone because you've given someone else what it feels like for you in that moment, your particular sadness.
I think definitely the whole gamut of emotions, but often for me, it's emotions I can't name. I mean, there are emotions, feelings that I find confounding. I don't even know how to describe them. And so poetry gives me an opportunity to bring that, to manifest or to bring form to these complexities.
So I would like you to probably describe shortly your poetic technique. Like this is my own. This is my unique technique. This is how you would recognize me. This is my poem. So you have any like technique or the images that you use very often, the symbols you use very often, the diction, the kind of diction that you use in your poetry, the kind of description that you always use in your poetry?
I think my approach to poetry is always speculative.
Okay.
For example, I just read in the previous panel a poem about a kid asking their aunt about hetero people, like because in the poem hetero people has gone from Earth. So I feel like doing this kind of what if, it also helped me to discover a feeling that might not, I don't consciously realize, I don't consciously feel. So it's a good way to do that.
Thank you. So I was told that we have only 5 minutes left, so I would like to use this time for Q&A. Any questions for our poets? Any comments, suggestions, please?
Thank you so much for your beautiful readings and for the discussion. I also think that it's really cool that all of you gathered together, write both poetry and prose. So I was wondering a bit about your creative processes and maybe when in your creative process do you first think about genre? Does it come at the beginning or does it come later after an idea or narrative? And are there specific things in your process that tilt you towards a poem as opposed to prose when you're thinking about making something?
I think for me, when it's poetry, usually it's a very abstract emotion. As I was mentioning earlier, there's this complex kind of vortex of feelings that I'm experiencing, and then I have a sensation that this is, because there's nothing very concrete yet, and I have to make something concrete out of that. But when it comes to prose, typically because I have a very visual imagination, so what happens is I see a character, I see a set. Typically, it's a setting. It's usually a house. I'm obsessed with houses. So a house, and like for example, my novel Yalpanam, the first thing that arose for me was an image of a very old, very large woman in a white sari squatting in a garden. I was like, who are you? Right? It's not a poem. I know it's not a poem. It's like, tell me, I mean, I want to get to know you better. And so it's like this momentum of exploration, and then the scene sort of opens up. So then it kind of expands in time and space. So to me, they're very distinct processes, and I tend to get a sense of when it's a poem and when it's, maybe if you ask me the question whether it's a short story or novel, that's more difficult. I think, I often kind of miss that. So I thought I was writing a short story, and then it turned out to be a novella, and, so yeah.
ครับผม ฝากถามอาจารย์สุรพีช่วยถามว่าพอเขาเขียนบทกวีแล้วอ่ะเขาจัดทำเป็นเล่มรวมเล่มอ่ะในประเทศเขาอ่ะขายดีไหมเป็นที่นิยมไหมนะอยากจะทราบของแต่ละท่านนะครับ
The question is, after you have finished your poetry book, and the poetry book is published, and he would like to know whether it sells well. Does it sell, and does it sell well in your country? Because in comparison to novels and short stories, probably poetry is not as popular. So in Vietnam, probably in Canada, in Malaysia, in Indonesia.
I think, in a way, for me as a writer, I don't think too much about sales. I think about the gap, what gap my writing can fill, what type of things I want to see on the bookshelf. So for us, writers of color, especially in world literature, we always fight for more space to tell our own stories. So I think, I write poetry in Vietnamese and English now, and I am happy to say that my latest poetry collection, Tổ quốc gọi tên mình, did really well in Vietnam because some of my poems got written into songs. And they performed regularly on TV, and that's why they help sell the books. So
Very fortunate.
Yeah.
ค่ะก็ไม่ได้สนใจงานแต่ในที่สุดงานของเขานี่ก็เอาไปทำเป็นเพลงนะคะแล้วก็ Yes, please.
In Canada, there is a best-selling poet. Her name is Ruby Kaur. And so the idea that poetry doesn't sell isn't quite true. When I think about my own poetry, I'm not a bestseller as a poet. I sell my books at farmers markets and on the front lawn. And what's so lovely about that is I get to experience that moment where anyone who comes to the front lawn or the small press fair, I get to talk to them. I know every single one of my readers, and they care about what happens to me, if I have enough to eat. They care about that. And that exchange with a reader is so valuable, and you can't use a sale number or money to measure that, and to use it to measure for the quality of your work.
That's lovely, very lovely.
Same answer actually, because in Malaysia, similar answer. I mean, in Malaysia, it's a very small community, and typically, if you have poetry events, it's other poets attending, or are your students. I'm a teacher, so it is quite small, and it doesn't move as much. But people who come are genuinely interested in poetry, and that's, I feel, more important than numbers.
In Indonesia,
I mean, I was an accountant, so sometimes even at editing process, I have counted how many copies to reach break even. So yeah, it's very stressful life.
Okay. Well, I think that even though we would like to carry on the discussion, it's getting more and more interesting, but then time is running up. So I would like you to give a big applause to all our distinguished poets for their comments, for their sharing with us their experience and also their recital. And also thank you very much, the audience, without whom this event might not have become a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the inspiring pieces of poetry read. If you would like the speakers to sign a copy of your book, they will be heading down to the Nelson Hayes Library courtyard now. Thank you all for coming today.